The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse as Karoline Leavitt stood silently in the hallway, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of her worn canvas briefcase. She wasn't supposed to be here, not like this, not as a defendant, not with her reputation dragged through the mud by a case so unjust it defied belief. At just 28, Karoline had already built a name for herself as a fierce advocate for those without a voice, single mothers fighting to keep their homes, elderly veterans drowning in bureaucracy, teenagers wrongly accused because of the color of their skin. She charged nothing. She worked out of a tiny office sandwiched between a diner and a dry cleaner. And today, she was about to stand trial for contempt of court, a petty retaliation from a judge whose ego she'd bruised during a pro bono case she won against all odds. The courtroom doors opened with a soft groan, and Karoline stepped in. Inside sat Judge Malcolm Bryce, a man with a reputation as cold as the stone pillars that surrounded the room. A career judge with decades of experience, his eyes had long grown weary of what he saw as the arrogance of the young. To him, Karoline was just another upstart, a brash law school graduate who had embarrassed him when she dismantled a faulty ruling in his own courtroom, citing precedent he had overlooked. Rather than acknowledge his mistake, he fined her and summoned her back on a contempt charge. The courtroom was mostly empty save for a few curious spectators and an elderly janitor mopping quietly near the back. No camera crews. No public outrage. Just the soft rustle of papers and the judge's gavel calling the room to order. Karoline Leavitt, Judge Bryce said with the sternness of a man who had already decided the outcome. You are hereby fined $2,000 for contempt of court and are ordered to submit a formal apology within 10 days. Karoline stood calmly, her voice soft but unwavering. Your Honor, may I speak? You may, but make it brief. She opened her canvas briefcase and pulled out a single piece of paper, no lawyer, no legal team, just a single page. I'd like to read this letter into the record. The judge sighed but gestured for her to proceed. Karoline began to read, her voice shaking just slightly. I stand before you today not to deny your ruling, but to clarify the intent behind my actions. Last month, I defended a 19-year-old boy named Marcus Hill. He was wrongfully accused of assault, largely because of faulty security footage and the absence of legal counsel when he was interrogated. I challenged the legitimacy of his arrest because I believed, no, I knew, the law was on his side. And I was right. You fine me for contempt because I pushed too hard. Because I cited precedents that hadn't been referenced in your courtroom before. Because I made you look, if only briefly, fallible. But what I truly did was my job. She paused, looking up at the judge, who now sat rigid in his chair. I didn't come here to apologize for fighting for someone who had no one else. I came here to remind you what justice looks like when we stop chasing pride and start chasing truth. There was a silence in the room so thick it seemed to still the air. Judge Bryce cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. You're dismissed, Ms. Leavitt. I will reconsider the fine and issue a final decision within 48 hours. She nodded, gathered her things, and left without a word. 2 days passed. Karoline returned to her tiny office with its flickering fluorescent lights and a half-empty pot of coffee growing colder by the minute. Her desk was cluttered with manila folders, court notices, and post-it notes, each representing someone who couldn't afford justice but needed it anyway. She sat down to write closing arguments for her next case when the door creaked open. Standing there was the last person she expected to see, Judge Bryce. He looked different. Not in the way he dressed, still in his pristine black coat and polished shoes, but in the way his shoulders slumped, his face less stone and more sorrow. I hope I'm not intruding, he said quietly. Karoline blinked. Not at all, Your Honor. Please, come in. He stepped inside, glancing at the humble surroundings. This is where you work. She smiled. Justice doesn't need marble floors. He gave a small laugh, then turned serious. I read your letter again. 3 times, actually. And then I went back and reviewed the Marcus Hill case. You were right. About the precedent. About the process. About the truth. She didn't say anything, just waited. I rescinded your fine, he said. But that's not why I came. He pulled out a worn notebook and handed it to her. 30 years ago, I started writing a legal theory journal in law school. I never finished it. Life got in the way. But after reading your words, I found it again. And I realized. I lost something along the way. Somewhere between promotions and politics, I forgot why I started this journey. Karoline turned the notebook over in her hands, stunned. I'd like you to have it, he said. Maybe you'll finish it. Or maybe you'll write your own. She was speechless. But her eyes, shining with quiet resolve, said everything. A week later, a story began to circulate through legal circles, then online, then national news. Young lawyer defends justice, inspires judge to rethink his legacy. Interviews followed. Praise came flooding in, not just for Karoline, but for something deeper. People began talking about the forgotten heart of law. About humanity. About the difference one brave woman made by simply doing what was right. Karoline didn't change. She still showed up to her office early, brewed the same cheap coffee, and met with clients who had nothing but truth on their side. But something else had shifted. 2 months later, Judge Bryce retired. His final act as a judge. A signed recommendation letter nominating Karoline Leavitt to a federal clerkship, an opportunity that would give her the platform to change even more lives. But Karoline didn't accept. She stayed. She kept defending the people no one else would touch. And one day, when asked why she refused the offer, she simply said, because justice isn't something I want to rise above. It's something I want to stand beside. The emotional climax came not in a courtroom, but in a hospital room weeks later. Karoline had taken on a case involving a terminally ill single mother named Rebecca, whose insurance company refused to cover a life-saving experimental treatment. The odds were stacked. The court date was delayed. Hope was fading. And then Karoline did something no one expected, she started a campaign. She got the public involved. She rallied volunteers, wrote articles, called in every favor from every client she'd ever helped. Donations poured in. With teary eyes and trembling hands, Rebecca received the first dose of her treatment just days before the verdict was issued. Karoline still went to court. Still argued. Still won. But it was the generosity of strangers, the will of a community, and the tireless heart of a woman who refused to give up that saved a life. Rebecca lived. And on the day she rang the hospital bell signaling her recovery, she clutched Karoline's hand and whispered, "You weren't my lawyer. You were my miracle." Years passed. Karoline became more than a lawyer. She became a symbol. A movement. Law schools studied her letters. Judges quoted her in their rulings. She declined interviews, but always accepted letters, from children who wanted to be like her, from prisoners who found hope in her victories, from strangers who found their courage in her story. And Judge Bryce? He spent his retirement teaching ethics courses at community colleges, starting each class the same way. Once, I fined a young woman for embarrassing me in court. She taught me that the law isn't about pride. It's about people. She reminded me that the greatest legal minds don't speak the loudest. They speak the truest. He'd pause, eyes glistening. Her name was Karoline Leavitt. And she saved more than just her clients, she saved me, too. The final chapter of Karoline's story was never written in a legal textbook or displayed on some grand stage. It happened on a rainy afternoon in front of a modest courthouse, where a young intern nervously dropped her papers on the sidewalk. Karoline, umbrella in hand, bent down and helped her. "You okay?" she asked with a warm smile. The girl nodded, recognizing her instantly. "You're the Karoline Leavitt, right?" Karoline chuckled. "Just Karoline." The girl bit her lip. "I'm starting law school in the fall. I want to make a difference. Like you. Karoline placed a hand on her shoulder. Then remember this, the law is only powerful when it protects the powerless. Don't ever forget who you're fighting for. The girl beamed. Karoline walked away. And somewhere in the echoes of rain on the courthouse steps, Justice whispered her name.